Welcome to our vibrant network of governance, risk, compliance, and cybersecurity leaders. We share cutting-edge insights, best practices, and innovative strategies to empower professionals in navigating the dynamic cyber threat landscape. Join Circolo de CISO to ignite resilience and data protection across industries.
We are having a conversation on offensive security, and where we are discovering the darker side of the art of offensive security. So we did talk about what it entails in terms of offensive security. We did touch on vulnerability assessment, ethical sides of it. We did speak about red teaming, blue teaming, purple teaming, incident response, resilience, and the conversation. Those of you who missed it, we would urge you to look up our channel where you can actually find the previous episode. And today, for this conversation, Chathura, the question I have for you is, the regulators are becoming very, very concerned. So they are upping the game, right? So they are being very specific in certain elements of testing which needs to be done. And earlier it used to be centered around banking, finance, insurance organizations, typically the regulated organizations. And today with Data Protection Act and also the AI EU Act in play, and the next 2 to 3 years, almost every single organization is going to be covered under these requirements. That's my gauge. That's how I'm gauging it. But from where you're seated and the kind of conversations you're having with your peers, your clientele, and your friends working in different geographies across the world, how do you see this landscape evolving in the next 1 to 2 years?
Yep.
Chathura?
That's a wonderful question, Sujit. I think, it's actually evolving as we speak, right? So I think regulators have that power for a reason. Use it, right? So I think regulators are getting that message now and they're using it for better. So, in current, you touch base on few legal aspects and compliance aspects around, AI and data and all of that. End of the day, what are we trying to protect? Is data, right? So it's not a conversation in 2024 without data, AI, and quantum, right? So how we managing risk around AI? How we managing risk around quantum resilient cryptography and quantum form cryptography, right? So those are really interesting things when you look at data protection. And there are, in Australia we have a regulation called SOCI, Security of Critical Infrastructure. There are finances or banking in just one sector, and we do have 11 different sectors. You need to try really, really hard to not to fall into one of those 11 categories.
Okay.
Right? So it's very difficult, right? But and this is the fun part. The fun part is it's modern day. An organization can't really rely on or sustain on them by themselves, right? So you need to have suppliers, third parties, right, in this old supply chain, right? So there's a tendency of the supply chain getting compromised, right? So third party software, third party service providers, third party this, third party that, right? So there's a huge long tail of supply chain where you may not necessarily have the visibility to everything. So even suppliers have suppliers. So that's become your fourth parties, fifth parties. So how far down the rabbit hole you want to go down, right? And then sometimes it's becoming hectic and just unfathomable. We can't just do it, right? But that's the complexity we created in the modern world, right? So you make the system so complex and you don't understand it. So if you don't understand it, it's extremely difficult to protect, right? So this is the mess we're in at the moment, right? So if you look at recent supply chain vulnerabilities, So like the Move It one happened over last year. So about 2,000 organizations got ransomware because of that, right? So that's just a dependency an organization would have, right? So that's just one example. And these are the things we know. What are the things we don't know, right? So that unknown risk around third-party suppliers or third supply chain attacks, for me, that's the future, right? So that's where we need to increase our visibility on, and then focus more on to getting this supply chain right, and then have the right element of visibility into it. Some might say, oh, you know what, we do have agreements with all these suppliers, and then we fine. Yeah, you fine from a legal or regulation point of view, but what if when the hack happened? Whenever the data breach happened, the media or no one gonna bother about your supplier. They're gonna come after you. You have my data, you lost it. At
Yeah.
that time, you can't say, oh, you know what, it's not us, it's just them. They got compromised and then we got compromised. Well, it's not really a he says, she says conversation, because you're liable and you're accountable for these kind of things, right? So we can't just look at things at isolation anymore. We need to consider regulations, regulators, legal frameworks, and then even the countries you're dealing with. You might be in one part of the world where you may have relaxed control or relaxed regulation, but you're dealing with customers in a whole different part of the world, which they have heavy, like super heavy regulation like GDPR, DORA, and things like that, right? So you may need to comply with those things. Just because you didn't know, just because you choose to ignore, is not necessarily a good excuse, right? So you need to consider these compliance requirements, regulatory obligations, and your obligation as a good citizen to your clients, right?
Chathura, I mean, I would like to ask you this question. I keep asking colleagues and my friends who I meet often. Are we headed to an era where the cost of security is going to escalate because of these regulations? Or are we saying, take it or leave it? Meaning, if you want to do business, you better be compliant and ensure that you have ethical practices. Otherwise, don't get
Yeah,
in. What's the message?
yeah, yeah. I think so too. If you want to operate, for example, in light of CBEST, if you in the UK framework, right? If you want to operate as a bank, you better do this. If you fail to do this, you're no longer a bank. Full stop. You lose your financial services license. That's it.
So that brings to a very interesting situation. You did speak about the third party, fourth party, and then maybe the list goes on. Now think from a bank's perspective. They've got suppliers who are a third party, and then there are other services which they're dependent on others. And if you look at some of the breaches which have happened, it is the supply chain. You mentioned about the MOVIT, but then if you look at all the major breaches we've seen in the recent past, it's all about that. And in some cases, it's not necessarily IT systems. So some of them have broken into infrastructure or the environmental control systems, and they've gained access to the network and then laterally escalated or elevated their privileges.
Yep.
Where does it leave
So,
the industry? Or is it a good thing or a bad thing?
well, it's a good thing, because in the end of the day, you need to protect your customer information, your customer data. If you're
Yeah.
healthcare, you need to protect that extremely valuable information, too personal information about people's health and things like that, right? So, like I said earlier, try preventive, then try detective, then response, right? So this is the problem with defenders. We need to secure the organization 100%, 24/7, 365.
Yeah.
But from an attacker's point of view, they just need one time. They just need one lucky chance. They just need that random bored person to click on that link just one time, right? So that's create this whole complexity and make security practitioner job extremely hard.
what was going through my mind when you were explaining this last bit is a game of rugby. You have defenders, you have forwards, right? But you don't go forward, you pass a back ball behind you, and then you aim
Yep.
for the goal ahead of you, right? And when the
Yep.
defenses fail, that's a goal or that's a try,
That's it.
whatever you call
Yeah.
it, right? So I don't think there's better example than this. I'm sure there are
Yeah.
other sports where you can relate to, but this is a good example. So, right? You've
100%.
got to be resilient. You should be able to, have that stamina to play that 1.5 hours of game. That
Yep.
means you train
100%.
every day and test your defenses and your skill.
Correct. Because this is where all this, simulations, tabletop exercise comes in place. And then this is where even certification comes in place to skill up, right? So I know
Okay.
people has a view on certifications like, oh, what does certification give you? Oh, well, I do have another view on it. I do have a strong opinion about certifications. If you do a certification just because you need a piece of paper, well, that's useless. But the actual knowledge is not with that paper you get or the digital badge you get. It's that the process you went through in order to gain knowledge, to upgrade
Absolutely.
yourself, right? So having those certification doesn't mean anything, but it's prove you that you went through all of these hassles. You had that resilience to go through that process. Through this resiliency process, you change your behaviors, you change your thought process, you change your knowledge level from A to B throughout that process, right? So that's the lesson, and that's the value of the certification, not just a piece of paper.
Absolutely. And I'm in full agreement with what you just said. Certifications are not to flaunt it, but it is a platform through which you gain an insight to the best practices. And then when in real life, when you're out there, you can see the gap or you can see the deviation where there is a deviation from the stated best practices.
Yep.
And also, it inculcates a discipline in your mind to go through it systematically, not ad hoc. Right?
Yep.
You may say, okay, any which ways I get to the goal. Yes, you do. But that may be good for a person who is trying to break the controls and get there. It will work for them. But for a defender, it doesn't. You've got to find every single hole. And if you don't have a method to that madness, then you are just giving it away in a platter to that adversary
Yep.
to make good of it.
Correct. Yeah.
Closing thoughts, Chathura?
Yeah, I think my takeaway in being this years in the security is that it's not your data you're protecting, right? It's someone else's data. So you just need to be very careful about it.
Absolutely. I'm in total agreement, right? It is also you protect the other people's data and you live up to their expectations, right? So that's where the brand reputation comes in, number one.
Correct.
Number two, you also have your own organizational intellectual property data. So that also needs to be protected because that's what is going to give you that edge over your competition. Right. So with that note, I want to thank Chathura for your time. And viewers, thank you so much for tuning in and listening to all our videos or the episodes which we have in the past. And personally, I have gained having this conversation with you, Chathura, because you brought in the global context in terms of how and what different countries and different industries are doing with respect to adoption of best practices. So it's not good enough just implementing a control, but you need to have somebody test that control for you. You can't do this as a checklist because somebody said you need to have this, but you need to have a regime. This is like going to the gym and working out every day, right? Having the membership doesn't ensure that you're fit, right? So you've got to go through that grind. So with that note,
100%.
I would like to thank Chathura again for your time and your valuable insights. Much appreciated.
Thank you
And
very
I
much,
look
Sujit.
forward to
Thanks for
seeing
having me.
you I look forward to seeing you in another topic in the future.
Likewise,
Thank you so
Sujit.
much.
Take care.